Talk about chutzpah. Newly elected Joe Biden says he wants us to return to the era of civility. When have these people practiced civility? Let's go to the videotape.
No matter who you voted for, I'm certain of one thing. The vast majority of almost 150 million Americans who voted, they want to get the vitriol out of our politics. We're certainly not going to agree on a lot of issues, but at least we can agree to be civil with one another.
Remember Barry Goldwater?
Today as then, but more urgently and more broadly than then, the task of preserving and enlarging freedom at home and of safeguarding it from the forces of tyranny abroad is great enough to challenge all our resources and to require all our strength.
He was a Republican nominee in 1964. And guess what the California governor, Pat Brown, said about him?
The real major question that you have to ask yourself is, what would my opponent do as governor? How would he exercise the power and the prestige of governor?
And I'm quoting, "The stench of fascism is in the air," end of quote. William Clay Sr. was a congressman from Missouri. His son is still in the House. Guess what he said about Ronald Reagan? He said President Reagan was, quote, trying to replace the Bill of Rights with fascist precepts lifted verbatim from Mein Kampf. That would be the book written by Adolf Hitler.
Unable to overthrow the government by force, Hitler resolved to take it by political means. While in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which preaches his message of uniting all ethnic Germans and giving them more space to live. The book remains potent to this day.
And I take no glee in saying this, but Coretta Scott King said this about Ronald Reagan. "I am scared that if Ronald Reagan gets into office, we're going to see more of the Ku Klux Klan and a resurgence of the Nazi Party," end of quote.
A few isolated groups in the backwater of American life still hold perverted notions of what America is all about. Recently, in some places in the nation, there's been a disturbing reoccurrence of bigotry and violence. If I may, from the platform of this organization, known for its tolerance, I would like to address a few remarks to those groups who still adhere to senseless racism and religious prejudice. To those individuals who persist in such hateful behavior, if I were speaking to them instead of to you, I would say to them, you are the ones who are out of step with our society. You are the ones who willfully violate the meaning of the dream that is America. And this country, because of what it stands for, will not stand for your conduct.
And in the 90s, when the Republicans took control of the House and Newt Gingrich became the Speaker, John Dingell, a longtime congressman from Michigan, by the way, his wife, Debbie, took his seat when he died, compared the new legislature to the Duma and the Reichstag. Charming. And of course, Republican presidents have been called racist for a very long period of time. No one better at it than Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
Here's what the Congresswoman said about Bush 41. You know, the good Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. "I believe George Herbert Walker Bush is a racist for many, many reasons. He's a mean-spirited man who has no care or concern about what happens to the African American community. I truly believe that," end of quote.
The gentleman is out of order.
I don't think Ms. Waters has anything to do with this line of questioning, Mr. Chairman.
I most certainly do. I have to do.
Apparently looks upon herself as the defender of the White House. I have the right to ask questions. You had your chance. Why don't you just sit there?
You are out of order.
You are always out of order.
You are out of order. Shut up.
What was that? What was the last remark? No, I didn't hear. I'd like to hear it again.
Oh, yes. I find it very interesting.
No, I would like you to say it again.
You heard what I said.
No, I didn't hear it.
I said you're out of order.
Okay. I said you were always out of order. Okay.
And Ms.
I think the
Waters,
record will speak for itself, and I just...
Mr. King,
I would like to say,
you
I
are
think it was
out
Patrick,
of
Ms.
order.
Waters.
He is out of order, Mr. Chairman.
I don't think anyone needs
Order,
these
Mr.
waters
Chairman.
butting in all the time. No one
Order,
cares when
Mr.
you're
Chairman.
Nobody cares about you.
Order, Mr. Chairman.
And Charlie Rangel was a longtime Democrat congressman from Harlem. Here's what he said about the Republican-controlled 1994 House. He said they don't say spick or nigger anymore. They just say, let's cut taxes. 10 years later, he said this about George W. Bush. George W. Bush is, quote, our Bull Connor, end of quote. You have any idea who Bull Connor was?
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Did you know Donna Brazile was Al Gore's campaign manager, failed campaign manager? She's now a Fox News analyst, was an executive with the DNC. Here's what she said about the Republican Party. Republicans have a, quote, white boy attitude, which means I must exclude, denigrate, and leave behind. They don't see it or think about it. It's a culture, end of quote. And the following year, she said this about a couple of prominent Republicans. The Republicans bring out Colin Powell, who became Secretary of State, and Congressman J.C. Watts, Republican from Oklahoma, because they have no program, no policy. They'd rather take pictures with black children than feed them, end of quote. About the George W. Bush administration, Al Gore said this: George W. Bush's executive branch has made it a practice to try and control and intimidate news organizations, from PBS to CBS to Newsweek. And every day they unleash squadrons of digital brown shirts to harass and hector any journalist who is critical of the president, end of quote.
The original task of the SA was to protect their prized asset Adolf Hitler, as such speeches and gatherings would often attract communists, the SA's enemies, and would result in ferocious brawls and violence. This would play into Hitler's hands, as the members of the SA were made up mostly of old military, who certainly knew how to handle themselves, and they knew how to deal with these events when it kicked off. When fights would break out, the police under the Weimar government were usually unable to cope and were powerless, and it would be the SA who would restore law and order.
The famed entertainer Harry Belafonte, activist, very close friend of Martin Luther King, was not a fan of the George W. Bush administration and considered George W. Bush to be racist.
If people are coming to open your mail and tap your phone and invade your privacy, if people are in Katrina desperate for help and are not getting it from the most powerful man in the world, he's brought terror into the hearts of our people. And in the dictionary, anyone who brings terror to people is an act of terrorism and a terrorist.
When somebody pointed out that Bush had a lot of prominent blacks in his administration, Belafonte said this: Hitler had a lot of Jews high up in the hierarchy of the Third Reich, end of quote. And the billionaire Democrat donor George Soros had some very kind things to say about Bush 43. Here's what he said: When I hear Bush say you're either with us or against us, it reminds me of the Germans. The Bush administration and the Nazi communist regimes all engaged in the politics of fear. Indeed, the Bush administration has been able to improve on the techniques used by the Nazi communists and propaganda machines, end of quote. Julian Bond was the head of the NAACP. In a 2006 speech at a historically black college, here's what he said: The Republican Party would have the American flag and the swastika flying side by side. Governor Howard Dean of Vermont, then the chairman of the DNC, said this: The contest between Democrats and Republicans is, quote, a struggle between the good and the evil, and we're the good. And 3 years later, Dean referred to the Republican Party as, wait for it, the white party. That brings us to Barney Frank, the longtime Democrat congressman from Massachusetts, who said that the reason George W. Bush responded so sluggishly, in his view, to Hurricane Katrina is because he was engaging in ethnic cleansing by inaction. He called it ethnic cleansing by inaction. So, by simply not doing anything to alleviate this, they let the hurricane do the ethnic cleansing, and their hands are clean. End of quote. And feminist attorney Gloria Allred in 2001 referred to Colin Powell and Condi Rice as Uncle Tom types. 5 years later, Hillary complained about the Republican-controlled House and said, "This place is run like a plantation, and you know what I'm talking about."
Because when you look at the way the House of Representatives has been run, it has been run like a plantation, and you know what I'm talking about.
How is my impression? This brings us to Debbie Wasserman Schultz, another former chair of the DNC. She said about Republicans that Republicans want to literally drag us all the way back to Jim Crow laws. End of quote. So, I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to this return to the era when Democrats practiced civility, because they never did. Guess what just happened? We've been demonetized by YouTube. That's right, Epic Times channels have been demonetized. But I've got some exciting news. It means we must be doing something right. Frankly, I'm amazed it took them so long. Here's what I want you to do. If you want to keep supporting us, just go to LarryTube.com. If you want to hear me uncensored and on demand, LarryTube.com. That's all, because we've got a country to save. I'll see you next time. YouTube, what took so long?